Something I've been thinking about for a while is whether gamers are still playing a lot of video games, or whether a lot of gamers have turned into spectators instead. I've seen this phenomenon on and off among some people that I know. However, knowing a couple of people like this that prefer looking at modern games or just watching a bunch of videos instead of playing them isn't the same thing as the majority of gamers being this way. But then there was a study late last year which found that gamers spend an average of 8.5 hours per week watching videos about video games, compared to 7.4 hours a week playing them. Initially, my gut reaction was that people need to spend more time playing video games, but the more I thought about it, and thought about my time growing up and playing video games, the more I realized that it isn't really that simple. The truth is, we've been video game spectators at some point or another, but it looks a little bit different nowadays, so I want to talk about that. I also want to discuss the concerns that I do have for Generation Alpha, the little kids that are growing up with gaming today, and how they might be getting turned into the wrong kind of video game spectator, or even worse, they may be getting distracted away from gaming altogether. So to get going, I'll start off by talking about what video game spectating was a long time ago and how it changed. Like I said in the introduction, we've all been quote-unquote video game spectators at some point. I'll give you a great example. When you were younger, did you ever watch your older sibling play a single-player game simply because it didn't allow for two players at the same time? I know I watched my older brother play plenty of Super Nintendo RPGs back in the day. In fact, I got Final Fantasy VI spoiled for me back then, and I've had a hard time going back to play it because I still remember a lot of the big moments from that game. But well before the Super Nintendo era, there was a time when many video games did not allow for two players on the screen at the same time. Sure, there was always Pong, but not every game was like that. In particular, I'm thinking of classic arcade games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Galaga. And some games were just single player, even in arcades. If you were waiting on someone to finish playing a credit of Galaga, you were usually standing there on the side of the cabinet or right behind, waiting for that person to be done playing. You might have even gotten lucky and watched somebody who was really good at a game, allowing you to learn some tricks that you didn't know before. Even if we're talking about generations 5 and 6, when split-screen 4-player multiplayer took off, if you didn't have enough controllers for everyone, if you were short, whoever was in last place might have gotten off in order to let someone else have a try. If you had 5 people and there was a 4-player GoldenEye or Perfect Dark match, someone had to just sit back and watch. And offline multiplayer was king on consoles back then because online multiplayer on consoles as we know it today was not a thing until the Sega Dreamcast. Of course, online multiplayer is now king. Nowadays, it's kind of hard to find games that people can play together in the same room outside of maybe fighting games, for example. Nintendo still seems to believe in offline multiplayer, but a lot of companies have thrown that concept away. Then again, split-screen gaming was never really ideal, and LAN parties involve more work to set up than online games. With the rise of the first-person shooter genre as the dominant genre in gaming, especially after Gen 6, this was probably inevitable anyway. That being said, playing games online just isn't as social as being in the same room as someone else. Outside of watching someone else play video games, we didn't have online videos back then, but a lot of us had access to magazines like GamePro and Nintendo Power. These were easily found in stores with a magazine section. My brother and I had a Nintendo Power subscription back in the day. Before the internet, magazines like those were the only ones to get information about games ahead of time, in order to figure out what games were worth buying, which ones were maybe worth a rental, and which ones needed to be avoided altogether, like Lord of the Rings on Super Nintendo or Superman 64. Not only did these magazines have reviews, but also news stories and previews of upcoming games. including screenshots that got you excited, especially if the game was something you were looking forward to in the first place. These magazines used to play a big role in generating hype for new consoles, whenever a new console generation was on the horizon. Another thing that I remember back then were physical strategy guides. I remember having quite a few of them. Having a Nintendo Power subscription made it a bit easier to order these for Nintendo published games, but you could still find these in stores as well for a while, not just for Nintendo games but for games on other systems. Anybody remember Prima Games and their guides? Good times. By the way, they still have a website even to this day. I didn't even realize that until I was doing research for this video. As far as video games on television went, you didn't see them a whole lot outside of commercials. Sometimes you'd see something game related given away on a game show. Nickelodeon Arcade was a rare case of games being played on TV in the early 90s. But even that game show didn't leave as much of a lasting impression on kids back then as, let's say, Legends of the Hidden Temple or Double Dare. Esports was in its infancy and not something you heard much about outside of the internet until MLG in the mid to late 2000s when they got on the USA Network briefly. G4 came out in 2002, and before that it was known as Tech TV. However, not all of us had G4, and even when I did see some episodes of X-Play at someone else's house, I wasn't even all that impressed. I'm not surprised that the revival failed, to be honest, but that is a different discussion entirely. When the internet first started getting big in the 90s, it did not replace the gaming magazines overnight. Early on, we just had dial-up, which was extremely slow even with the smaller websites of the time period. The first time I ever used the internet was at someone else's house in order to go to Nintendo.com and get cheat codes for games. It took until maybe the end of the 90s, if not the early 2000s, for sites like IGN, GameFAQs, and GameSpot to really hit their stride. GameSpy was also a popular site back then, if anyone remembers that. Most of these sites did have video content by the early to mid 2000s, but that content was a pretty low video quality by today's standards. By the early 2000s, people were starting to move from dial-up to faster forms of internet. YouTube was not a thing until 2005, but there was still plenty of gaming talk out there on the internet even without YouTube or social media being a thing outside of maybe MySpace, which would have been early on in its lifespan. We had plenty of busy online communities on sites like GameFAQs and GameSpot, which both had message boards. Social media sites including Reddit would eventually kill off a lot of these old message boards though. I only bring a lot of this up because those were things that we spent time on related to video games back then that did not involve us playing video games directly. I know I consumed plenty of video game media 20 years ago. I'm sure a lot of you watching that are close to my age or a bit older did as well. That's especially true if you were really into video games back in those days. We had to work a little bit to learn more about what was going on in the gaming industry at the time. Things weren't always better back then though, but you appreciated whatever information you could find, assuming it was legitimate. So how has the consumption of video game related media changed? Well, there are a lot more ways to be engaged beyond playing video games, thanks to the internet of today. You don't have to be in the same room to watch someone else play video games anymore. You can see that on YouTube and Twitch, as well as other places. I even post my own playthroughs of games from time to time, so I'm definitely contributing to this. It used to be that if you needed help with a game, you had to read a strategy guide. While I wouldn't say that all strategy guides have been rendered obsolete, watching someone else beat a difficult section of a game can be more helpful than reading a guide. And then there are all of us that are doing discussion videos, and the amount of news videos out there on gaming is insane on YouTube alone. If you don't like reading articles, you don't have to. In fact, a lot of people have clearly opted out of that because the gaming press has been struggling as of late. Places like IGN and GameSpot used to be king, but not anymore. They can't even compete with the biggest gaming YouTubers out there. To be honest, I don't miss the gaming press one bit. They've been compromised for a long time and are way too content with propping up the status quo. Plus, some of the people who work at these companies can barely even play video games in the first place. And because there are so many people doing video content about games, you can find video games about so many classic and modern games that the gaming media would never give any attention to in the first place. If you want to find videos dedicated to the original Game Boy's library, that's easy. If you want to find someone who discusses roguelikes or someone dedicated to arcade games, you could probably find that as well. Just about every niche in video games has someone making video games about it. Online gaming communities have changed as well. It used to be ages ago you only had bulletin boards. That was in the early days of the internet though. But then you had chat rooms, and then message boards, and now you have Reddit and Discord primarily, as well as massive social media sites like Facebook and X. I actually have more that I want to say about Reddit and Discord, but they have definitely replaced the message boards for the most part. A lot of message boards have shut down like GameSpot's message boards did, or have gone into decline like the ones on GameFAQs have. Now you still have some places like 4chan that are outside of the mainstream, but still have an influence of some sort. But I don't see people talk about it as much today as compared to 15 years ago. But going back to Facebook and X, gamers have a more direct line of communication with game developers and other famous people associated with the industry. If you mention the lead developer of a game on X and criticize his or her game, you may get a response back, you never know. It's much better than writing a letter and mailing it off hoping to get a reply. In a lot of ways, it's really cool that we have more ways to engage with this hobby than just playing video games. It is also a lot easier to find people that have the same gaming interests as you. I know I found good communities online over the years, like the Western Shmup community for example. I only know a few people in real life who like shmups, but there's a lot more of them online. I'm sure there are a lot of other people besides me who have found good communities for other niche topics, not just games. In some ways, there's never been a better time to be a gamer. So who am I really worried about here? I'm worried mostly about the younger kids that are growing up with gaming right now. Generation Alpha. Gen Alpha is known right now for being a generation full of what some people would refer to as iPad babies. They're spending a large amount of screen time watching videos on their parents' phones and tablets. There has been research already proving that this is not good for their brains to begin with. Studies have shown that too much of it stunts development of children younger than age 5. As children ages 2 through 5 are only supposed to have 1 hour screen time per day, according to the American Association of Pediatrics. I highly doubt that most Gen Alpha parents, or the grandparents of these kids for that matter, are counting the screen time very closely. But what about for gaming itself? It seems like video content on YouTube, for example, would be a great way to get young children into video games, right? Look at how big Minecraft YouTubers are with little kids. Look how popular they are among them. But what I worry about is these kids getting hooked on the personality, screaming on camera and acting silly instead of the actual games. I know my nephew in elementary school has watched hours and hours of Minecraft YouTubers at this point, but that hasn't necessarily translated to him playing a lot of Minecraft necessarily. Granted, he does play video games thanks to his father being a real gamer, so I wouldn't call him a lost cause per se. I worry more about the kids who don't necessarily have a good parent that loves games. I worry about the kids with parents who just give them the phone to keep them occupied without anybody around that's a serious gamer, and tell them, hey, you should play this game, instead of just watching a bunch of YouTube videos all day long. At least back when I was a kid, when video game magazines were the main gaming related media outside of games themselves, you at least had to know how to read at a halfway decent level. So you had some extra incentive to know how to read. But video game magazines are pretty much dead, and the kids nowadays just have videos they sit in front of and they press play and watch them. Not much effort involved in doing that. Sometimes I wonder if some of these kids are just happy watching someone else playing a game instead of wanting to learn how to play the games themselves, especially when they're watching videos on YouTube. Even some adults would rather just watch someone else play a game instead of playing themselves. Are these kids going to develop the same skills that a lot of us had to develop over time? Or are these kids just going to become zombies instead of active participants? I know I got much better at video games once my brother went to college and moved away. I had no other choice but to get better because my brother wasn't going to be able to bail me out any longer. Prior to that, I depend on him a lot to get through games. I'm not even sure if these young kids growing up today have the same desire to play games or get better at them, especially the more challenging games out there. I hope they do, but I have a bad feeling that a lot of them are going to drop video games at some point in favor of social media. Social media is designed to be addictive nowadays in order to keep people on these sites and viewing ads. Younger people are still falling for the allure of these sites. For example, see the rise of TikTok. Also, look at Twitch and the fact that gamers spent over 1.7 million hours watching content on the site just last month. The sad thing with Twitch is a lot of that isn't even gamer related content anymore, as the just chatting section dominates that site nowadays. But on the other hand, I have run into some young Gen Z gamers that are very talented at video games, including both in person and online. That includes at least one Mega Man X2 speedrunner that I met in real life months ago. This guy was born way after that game originally came out. There's some really good shmup players, for example, that are very young, still very young, just barely out of high school or still in high school, that can 1cc some pretty difficult shmups. So clearly there are still plenty of younger dedicated gamers out there, and that gives me hope for Generation Alpha as well to possibly be the same way. But there is a downside that I've seen with younger members of Gen Z in person, and it's the fact that their social skills are just not there overall compared to previous generations. I've seen this a lot in person. I imagine COVID and the lockdowns did a number on some of them. I get that, but it is what it is, and I do have to point that out. And we'll just have to see what happens with Generation Alpha in the next decade. Overall, I'm not worried about older gamers watching a lot of videos about games. I think a lot of that audience has other things to worry about besides video games, and they lack the ability to commit as much time to playing them due to family and work obligations. Plus, some of them have already spent a ton of time playing games in the past. I worry more about the youngest members of Gen Z, but more importantly, I worry about Generation Alpha. Also, I wonder if the video game media consumption of today is more mindless than what I experienced growing up. You had to work a little bit for it decades ago, but everything is just a few clicks away now and involves no reading or critical thinking skills. Between that and just the amount of screen time that a lot of the Gen Alpha kids are getting nowadays, I worry that they are more likely to get hooked on TikTok later on than playing great game after great game from start to finish. But again, we will just have to wait and see. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you also remember what the gaming world was like before YouTube and social media? Are you concerned about the gamers of tomorrow being too distracted to actually play video games? Or do you think that concern is overblown? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.